in this genealogy today, and we are going to see how the grace of God was active in their lives. Now, the two men that I've chosen are very common names in the Bible, names that you're probably very, very familiar with. The first one is a man by the name of Abraham. One of the easiest things for people to misunderstand in Scripture is why God gives grace to certain people. I remember hearing a sermon one time at a conference. I haven't been back to this particular conference, by the way, and if I walk away from this microphone, there are people who are going to really get me, so I gotta stay close. But I remember this conference, the guy was saying, well, God gave His grace to this person because, this was a really good person. This was this is really a deserving person. This person really, they were good, faithful people, and that's why God gave His grace to them. Well, if that's the truth, then that's not what grace is. Paul tells us that very thing, that if grace is given because it's owed, then grace is not grace anymore, but what is due. It is common to look at figures in the Bible like Abraham and assume that he was worthy of God's attention. But the truth is that Abraham was a human being, just like you and just like I. And Abraham was a sinner. Abraham was not perfect. Abraham sinned, and the Bible actually records his sin. The Bible records twice him lying about the identity of his wife to save his own skin. If you remember, his wife was beautiful. In fact, Hebrew literature, extra-biblical literature actually describes Sarah as being one of the most beautiful women of antiquity, that she would have been beautiful beyond compare in her day. And Abraham's wife, every time he would take her into a new city, he was frightened to death that someone would kill him to take his wife. So he would say, "This is my sister." Now, truth be told, she was his half-sister, so some people say it's only a half-lie. Well, a half-lie is a whole lie. Because he was saying she was his sister, not because he was trying to identify her as his half-sister, but he was saying she was his sister because he was trying to save his own skin. He was afraid that someone would take her and take his life. It was a lack of faith, really, and thus was a sin. That which is not done of faith is sin, the Bible tells us in Romans. And Abraham sinned. Genesis chapter 12 tells us the story, and Genesis chapter 20 tells us a very similar story. Same man, same situation, did it twice. He also attempted to circumvent God's plan by having a child with his wife's handmaiden. We remember that story, the story of Hagar. I've always thought that was a very interesting name for a woman. Well, I assume at that point in time it probably wasn't as odd as it sounds today. Every time I think of the name Hagar, I think of that little cartoon, Hagar the Horrible. But Hagar was his wife's handmaiden. And God had promised him a son, and after many years of not having a child with his wife Sarah, his wife said, "Well, go here, take my handmaiden as a second wife, and she will provide for you a son." And then that's what happened. Ishmael was born, through whom came the whole nation that would be perpetually at odds with God's people, even up to today. So we see Abraham, when you look at his life as a whole, yes, he was called a friend of God, but at the same time, he is a sinner. And I'm not trying to take Abraham and throw him into the gutter or take away his prominence in the Scripture. I'm simply pointing out the fact that he was a man who was not righteous in and of himself. He was righteous because God made him righteous. God declared him righteous. God's grace saved Abraham. In fact, the Apostle Paul asked this question in Romans chapter 4. And if you're here on Wednesday night, you've heard some of these things because we've been studying the life of Abraham. And what did Paul ask about Abraham in Romans 4? He says, "What shall we say was gained by Abraham according to the flesh?" And the answer Paul gives is nothing. Nothing was gained by Abraham according to what he did. Abraham's gain was the grace of God. So when we consider Abraham, we often exalt him as a great human being. And in human terms, he was a great man. He was called the friend of God, yet at the same time, his friendship was not based upon his goodness, it was based upon the goodness of God. God's grace was given to Abraham and he was saved. Even great faith heroes like Abraham need grace. That's the point of Abraham. Now the second man I want to talk about is also very famous, also very common name in the Scriptures, and that's the name King David. Now, where Abraham is held up as the epitome of faith, David is often looked at for another situation in his life. We look at David, we say David was a great man of faith. He certainly had the faith to kill Goliath. He had the faith to go out onto the battlefield and take nothing but 5 smooth stones and slay the great 9-foot warrior Goliath. Yet at the same time, David had another situation in his life that he was probably more well known for. David stood on his roof while the other kings were at battle. He was at home relaxing, and he looked out from his rooftop and he saw a woman, and she was bathing. And he inquired about this woman whom he was physically attracted to, and he found out she was the wife of one of his most faithful soldiers. Yet at the same time, he didn't fight his sinful urge. He sent for her to be brought to him and took her for himself, and in doing so impregnated her. As a result, what did he do? Did he come clean and say, I've sinned, O God, and I've sinned against Uriah, and I've sinned against my country, my nation? No, what did he do? He called for Uriah to come back. He says, I'm going to send Uriah home, and he'll think the kid's his. I'll be off scot-free. But Uriah was a better soldier than David was a king. And Uriah wouldn't go home. Even after David tried to get him inebriated and send him home, he stood at the king's steps and said, I won't go home and enjoy my home while my brothers are dying in battle. Uriah had the character that David so sorely lacked. So David did what? Come clean, right? And he said, Uriah, I'm sorry, I made a mistake. No, he didn't. David wrote a letter to the head of the army, and he said, next time you go out in battle, you take Uriah out to the middle of the battlefield, and then everybody retreat and leave Uriah by himself, ensuring his death. So that after Uriah died, David could take Bathsheba. No harm, no foul. Well, except for Uriah. Now, considering all that, it's not hard to say David was a sinner. He was a liar, he was an adulterer, he was a murderer in the end, and yet even then, he was not so bad that God's grace couldn't save him. You see, that's the two things that we see in Abraham and David. In Abraham, we see a man who, as good as he was, still needed God's grace. And in David, we see a man who, as bad as he was, wasn't so far gone that God's grace couldn't reach him.